and good morning. It is August 19th, 2021, and welcome to We'll Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. We have another fantastic program for you today. They're all fantastic, of course, and we're so happy that you're here. We'll Work for Food was formed back in the spring of 2020 by Natalie Armstrong Moton, who realized the need that there was for food insecurity, and then started this program. She was joined by Jeff Kachavan shortly thereafter. This program started becoming a regular on Thursday mornings Pacific time, and I was honored to be able to join in the new year. Along now, let me introduce Sari also to you. She's our new administrative assistant and helps to get things going. So Sari's in Canada. We're quite global here. Anyway, it's great to see everyone. As you know, we don't ask any or charge anything for these programs. They're available afterwards on video. All we ask is that you make a donation and some amount, whatever you can handle, to a food bank of your choice or of the speaker's choice. And then if you're so inclined and would be willing to let Natalie know how much you donated, we will add it to our running total. Obviously, our running total reflects only the amounts that we have been advised of. So, Jeff, where are we now?
Jean, thank you so much. Our audiences have been so generous over the past year and a half. Our running total so far, contributions made by members of the legal and ADR communities, $156,467 to fight food insecurity all around the world. Thank you so much.
That is so fantastic. That's just amazing. Maybe we'll get over the $160,000 mark this week. That would be just great. But without further ado, we have a very interesting topic today, and I promise you our speakers will be able to more than fill the hour. So I won't take much time, but let me first introduce Marisa Trasatti to you, and then she will introduce the rest of her panel. Marisa is General Counsel of the California-based dermatological laser and light medical device company, Cyton Inc., and she's a partner at Wilson Elzer, Moskowitz, Edelman, and Dicker. Her practice focuses primarily on civil litigation with an emphasis on products liability litigation, including cases involving drugs and medical devices. She has authored many articles, presented on many topics, including cybersecurity, crisis management, GDPR, social media, et cetera, et cetera. Premises liability, in particular, is one area that ties in with the human trafficking area, in which Marisa now, which is wonderful that she has become an expert in this. It's just not wonderful that it even exists for someone to become an expert in. However, Marisa and the speakers today all have great experience, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, in that area. Marisa is a past president of the Maryland Defense Council, her local Defense Bar Association. She is a past president of CLM's Maryland chapter, is a senior director with the FDCC, was recently awarded the FDCC's Hecker Award, which is one of its highest honors. And she serves as the DRI Maryland State Representative. She, of course, has many, many more qualifications and wonderful things on her resume. Please feel free to look her up on her firm website and learn all about her. That said, Marisa, why don't you tell us about your food bank and then introduce your team, who will talk to us today about human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that warm welcome. It is really a privilege and an honor to be presenting for We'll Work for Food. We are excited to be here and talk about this topic, which, you know, knowledge is power. That's what it comes down to. And so we hope that you take away from this presentation some tips on how to spot human trafficking and some of the countermeasures that exist out there. We are presenting on behalf of the Maryland Food Bank, which is a 93,000 square foot operation in Baltimore, with its central hub for food distribution to Central Maryland. The Baltimore office holds about 100 employees, or 80% of the food bank's total workforce. The food bank statewide campaigns and initiatives in fiscal year 19, the branch distributed more than 27.4 million meals to food insecure Marylanders. So they're doing a great job, and we're going to hopefully help them continue to do a great job. Without further ado, I'm going to present to you my panelists today. Two of these panelists and I have worked closely together since at least 2017, when I had the first 4 Maryland human trafficking cases involving hoteliers. Dr. Orozco, Kimberly Mehlman Orozco, you'll see her on that screen, is a social scientist, an author. In fact, she just authored a children's book on human trafficking and plans to publish additional volumes in that regard. She'll talk about that. But she's the leading human trafficking expert witness. And we were so fortunate to meet Dr. Orozco in 2017. We found an article by her, we reached out to her, and I can't tell you the countless conversations we had before depositions where she was priming me on how to depose a trafficker, how to depose a victim. Dr. Orozco is the author of Hidden in Plain Sight, America's Slaves of the New Millennium. And we're going to talk about the state of the art of human trafficking, which dates very far back. It's a training manual for law enforcement on human trafficking across the country. Dr. Orozco's innovative research has also been published in peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as a variety of media outlets, including USA Today, Politico, The Hill, Thomson Reuters, The Post, and the Houston Chronicle. She is also the executive director of Freedom Light, which is a 501c3 for trafficking victims. And she's been very active in the countermeasure efforts. And she'll talk a little bit about that during this presentation. Brittany Harvey. Brittany Harvey, I met through those first 4 cases in Maryland, and she is a claims representative out of Denver, Colorado. Brittany first learned of these cases and reached out via the FDCC Blue Book. You heard Jean Lawler talk about my connection to FDCC and her connection as a past president, the first female past president of FDCC. So Brittany is the chief claims specialist. She manages a desk of specialty type risks and exposures, primarily litigated, consisting of diverse defense and coverage issues. Brittany's going to discuss the coverage issues inherent in these cases. And she's going to talk about some of the terms in the policies that are being disputed during those coverage cases. She's a 2010 graduate of Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, with majors in risk management and insurance and finance and banking. She has worked previously with various insurers, and her concentration is primarily in commercial general liability and auto litigation. So imagine her surprise when she received these human trafficking cases. 60 or 70 pages long and not short on details. She and I will never forget when those cases came in, and she'll talk a little bit about that. Last but certainly not least, we have John Loyal, who is more than welcome to this panel. He brings his expertise in cybersecurity, and he's going to talk to us about the countermeasures that Thorn and others are lending to the cause in order to eradicate human trafficking around the globe. John is a partner at Cipriani and Werner. He's a previous executive at an insurance company, and he specializes and co-chairs Cipriani and Werner's cybersecurity, information privacy, and data security team. So welcome, John. All right, I am going to share my screen if I can. Here we go. All right. So hopefully you can see on the screen the slides. Let's talk a little bit about, awesome. Let's talk about generally what human trafficking is. And Dr. Orozco, I want to lead with you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the title of your book and how that arrived, and then walk us through labor versus sex trafficking, which are the major subtitles for trafficking.
Sure. So first off, thank you for inviting me to participate in this presentation. I'm excited to be here. So human trafficking, when we think of human trafficking, really we're talking about modern day slavery. So if you look at the trajectory and how trafficking came to be, it was adjusting and updating laws on forced labor, on slavery, to accommodate some of the modern forms. So instead of just focusing on physical force and actual threats, they wanted to incorporate in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is our large piece of federal legislation to address trafficking. They wanted to include coercion, deception, some more elements of mental manipulation. So if you're talking about modern forms of slavery, human trafficking, more often than not, it's not like the movie Taken, where a clearly innocent victim is physically kidnapped and held against your will. It involves more deception, coercion, threats, things that you can't necessarily see or assess from looking at somebody or even talking to them. It's difficult to identify. So Marisa talked about the title of my first book, Hidden in Plain Sight. I entitled it that because it really is a hidden crime. Every person who's watching this presentation, we have all encountered a victim at some point in our life. We have used the products of slavery without knowing it. We've consumed the products of slavery as well. And it is almost unavoidable. Even businesses and corporations that are really just going above and beyond the standard business practices find it hard to completely eradicate any forms of exploitation down their supply chains because of how prolific it is. As far as the difference between labor and sex trafficking, so that we have this overarching term of human trafficking talking about modern slavery, and then the two major subtypes are labor trafficking and sex trafficking. In the media, you hear a lot about sex trafficking, but actually, I would say prevalence is looking at more people who are trafficked through labor trafficking, including men as well as women and children. So with labor trafficking, they're using false promises for high-paying jobs. It doesn't necessarily need to involve international travel or even interstate travel. You can be trafficked within your own state, within your own community even, because the definition of trafficking is the use of force, fraud, coercion, deception, or threat for the purpose of exploitation or the exploitation of anyone under the age of 18. That second part is important in particular for sex trafficking because a minor cannot consent to be trafficked. So they can't say, I'm consenting to be exploited in the commercial sex industry. Consent is not an affirmative defense. But even with those two major subtypes of labor trafficking and sex trafficking, there are even further delineations of typologies underneath those categories. So underneath sex trafficking, you can have adult sex trafficking, minor sex trafficking, gang-controlled sex trafficking, international sex tourism, military sex trafficking, or sex trafficking consumerism. With labor trafficking, you can find it in the agricultural industry, in chocolate manufacture, in textile industry. I mean, really, you can just find it in so many different businesses.
Dr. Orozco, we're going to move to Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you see here on the screen. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about the psychology of human trafficking survivors that you've seen?
So in my first book, I used Maslow's hierarchy in conjunction with trafficking. And I think I was the first person to do that. And I've seen people replicate it a number of times since then. So I really think I found something interesting as far as how people are recruited and controlled. So Maslow's hierarchy essentially is a theory, a psychological theory about human motivation. It says we're basically striving to meet our needs. At first, we're looking to meet our basic physiological needs: food, shelter, shelter, water, you know, just to basic sustenance. Then we're looking for safety, followed by love and belonging, then self-esteem, and then self-actualization. So as we're meeting those needs, as we meet physiological needs, safety needs, we just keep on going up that hierarchy. So essentially what a trafficker does is he or she is looking to see what void you have in meeting a need. And then he or she is making the false promise to fulfill that void. So for example, if you're a kid that's homeless, they're going to say, I'm going to provide you shelter, I'm going to provide you food and you know, basic sustenance. If you're a kid that's being maybe abused at home by a parent, they're going to say, I'm going to protect you. I'm your protection. I'll take care of you. No one's going to do that while I'm with you. If you are, you know, a girl that's looking for a significant other and that feeling of love and belonging, maybe you're isolated, you don't have a lot of friends, he's going to make that false promise to be that boyfriend, to be that family member that you aspire to have, or to have that connection or that relationship. He'll make that false promise. Or if you have low self-esteem, he or she will build it up. They really just go up that hierarchy. And so that's why you can see people who are susceptible from all walks of life. They don't need to be somebody who's marginalized or lower socioeconomic. They could be somebody who comes from an affluent family and he or she is making a false promise for self-actualization. I'll connect you with a modeling gig. Or the allegations against, a great example, allegations against Jeffrey Epstein. You know, I'm going to connect you with the rich and powerful and famous people. That's how he was able to deceive these girls to coming into a position where they could have been exploited or susceptible to sexual advances from an adult.
So that was certainly true in the cases that Brittany and I handled from a defense perspective. And I think Brittany was the first claims rep to ever sit through a deposition of a trafficking victim. Keep in mind, we had 4 different cases, and the plaintiff's lawyer led off with supposedly his best case. And this particular plaintiff was unbelievably changed from what she was versus what she became. So when she presented for her deposition, she appeared like she had everything together. She was well dressed, she was well heeled, she was well groomed. And then we started peeling back the onion and asking questions, and we learned that she came from a broken house. She came from a mother who had remarried, and her second husband was physically and sexually abusing her. We learned that she had gone to the police against her mother's wishes and reported it. She jumped from a second-story window to get the police's attention. And then she wound up meeting one of the traffickers, a female trafficker, who lured her into exotic dancing. And that day, when she was abducted, she was going to a dance for an older gentleman, so she thought. What actually happened, we learned, was that she was abducted. She was brought to a church where she was assaulted multiple times and then brought to a hotel. And that's where the rest of the doe's stories began. I want to turn to Brittany for a moment. Brittany, can you describe for the audience what you observed, what you heard in that first deposition of that doe number 4?
Yes. So this particular doe really hit me hard, just being that she was a young female. If I had seen her out on the street, I probably would not have known that she was being trafficked. It was not apparently obvious to me. And like Marisa said, as we started going through the deposition, it was just very surreal to me and very impactful, just the way that she had been mentally abused and had kind of been dealing with this mental tether, this connection to her trafficker. It was clear that not only had she been lured in by the concept of dancing, but also drugs. There were clear signs of drug abuse, just fulfilling that need, like Dr. Orozco talked about. It was very surreal to me because we all hear about these things and we see these things on the news or, on social media, but seeing it in person just made it that more real, and kind of reinforced the fact that it is so hidden. We've all seen it before and don't know that we've seen it. So she was clearly victimized, and had suffered great abuse because of this trafficking incident.
And then Brittany, juxtapose that with what we saw when we went to mediation with doe number 4.
Yes. So like you touched on, Marisa, during the deposition, she was very well dressed. It was clear that, her counsel wanted her to present very well. And then at the mediation, when we're talking about resolution in the case, she presented like she was strung out on something. She looked more like a victim. I think, they really wanted to make that impression on us. And that just spoke to, like I've touched on, and like we've all touched on, that it really can, these victims can wear two faces, and it is very hidden. So she clearly showed physical signs of that abuse without being questioned, and mental indications of that abuse. She had to take, step out because she would get upset. It was like we were looking at two different people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. John, you're going to talk to us about the industries impacted by labor trafficking. I know Dr. Orozco touched on them a bit, but do you want to give the audience sort of an overview?
Yeah, thanks. Exactly. And Dr. Orozco, I think, did touch on this. So I'll just briefly run through it. But, this slide is really about education here. And, I think when people think, labor trafficking, the immediate thought are, the sweatshops, out in Southeast Asia and the like, right? And it's much more than just that, right? And it's really touching many facets of industry. And a few listed here: agriculture, construction, factory work, right? And they're all built, a lot of these are all built on false promises. The promises of higher wages, the promises of medical assistance, right? Of vacation and sick time. And unfortunately, many of these individuals, all the individuals who end up into these positions are just misled by these promises. And ultimately, they get themselves into these situations, and now they're just being mentally and physically controlled by the individuals who brought them into these situations. And this is all about awareness for everyone here on this session. Of it is just not limited to what you may think and know about, and it is impacting many more industries than what you may hear in the mainstream media and what's been touched upon in the past.
John, since we have started doing these presentations back in probably 2017, 2018 timeframe, we've seen an evolution of sort of the spotlight that has been turned on human trafficking in general. It certainly began January of 2018 when I was about to argue my summary judgment, and Backpage is being indicted, and the jurist who was hearing the summary judgment immediately, right out of the box, asked a public policy question. He wasn't interested in the law. He wanted to know, if he granted the summary judgment for the hotelier, what was the blowback from that? And what I see currently is a movement amongst the corporate boards and the corporate officers in the ESG space wanting statements about preventing trafficking in the supply chain. However we can do it. DAC Beechcroft was one of the first, if not the first, law firm to put a human trafficking statement out on its website. And since then, I know a lot of companies, including Cytown, the company for which I'm general counsel, has also definitely espoused a anti-trafficking approach. Dr. Orozco, what do you know in that regard?
So just to come back a little bit to something that we said earlier, and to give a little bit of color to the audience members, I just wanted to point out that the beginning of my career, it was focusing on interviewing, because there's not a lot of data on trafficking because of how hidden it is. It's difficult to identify. I did a lot of qualitative interviews with convicted human traffickers. And one of the traffickers that I interviewed, he said this, he said, "A cunning individual is very capable of making another person believe that he or she is in control, concealing their intentions until they lead that person to the edge of the cliff." That quote from a convicted trafficker was very eye-opening to me, and I hope it is to you as well, to the fact that traffickers, they're concealing what they're doing. There are not overt signs of trafficking when you encounter a victim. You're not going to see bruises. You're not going to see, they're not going to even ask for help because of the mental manipulation. So as far as the industries impacted, labor trafficking is so prolific. It's almost in every industry. It's encountered by almost every type of business without you knowing it. So really, we're dealing with a crime that is becoming an epidemic, but that we still don't really have solid ways to combat the issue and to identify people who are engaging in this type of crime. So sorry, I just wanted to say that really quickly, Marisa, but what was your question again?
So absolutely hidden and clandestine. But I guess my question was, what are you seeing as far as businesses educating on trafficking and the ESG movement, if you will?
So, I wanted to make that point first because as far as educating and what businesses are doing, they're doing something called, they're focusing on best practices, right? They're being educated by a variety of different organizations that have come up with ideas on how to combat the issue, but really don't have a strong evidence base. As a social scientist, I'm looking for evidence-based interventions that really have a measurable impact. Specifically, I'm looking at the prevention of crimes, the identification of offenders and the prosecution of offenders, and the rescue and protection of victims. But really the things that we've seen come out of the interventions that are being taught to different industry leaders and different businesses is either A, we don't have any evidence of whether it's working, or B, the evidence is suggesting it's not working. I know, Marisa, earlier this year, you shared with me a journal article that was looking at some of the training protocols that they have of whether it's better to use, anecdote-based training, fact-based training, or looking at the different training protocols. And what they measured, though, on the efficacy of those different training protocols, it wasn't whether it actually had an effect in their ability to identify a victim or prevent these things from happening on premises. It was the memory or the recall. And they found that, using a facts-based approach was one of the better approaches than the red flags-based approach. But still, we have a very long way to go to determine what works. So as far as my opinion is concerned, really, I wouldn't hang my hat on any intervention. We're learning as we go, but whatever you do, you want to evaluate it for efficacy, specifically the sensitivity and specificity. How is it doing on identifying these cases when and if you encounter them, but also not misidentifying and assuming somebody's engaged in trafficking if they're not. And we've seen that as well, Marisa. I know that a lot of the industries were trained on one of the quote unquote red flags was if a child didn't look like it belonged to a parent. And what the result was, they were pulling out mixed race families as being potential trafficking situations. You can't do that. You can't violate somebody's civil rights or liberties with the quote unquote good intention of combating trafficking. You need to find what works. You need to evaluate it for efficacy, and just be very wary of organizations that purport to be experts, because they're not all created equal.
We'll talk more about those countermeasures and also the countermeasures that are targeted to the demand, not just the supply, later on in this presentation. But from an overview standpoint, as far as the cases that are out there, for those of you who are mediators and arbitrators, we actually used a retired judge in the Maryland cases from Baltimore City Circuit Court. These were the first cases to go to mediation. It was a huge learning curve for him and obviously for us. And ultimately the case is resolved. But what we have seen in this litigation is a few waves. The first wave is what I would call what Brittany and I had back in 2017 and 2018. They were independently owned motels. So they were motels, single story, maybe 2-story at most, with exterior stairwells and exterior doors. So people could just drive up to the room door without going through the main desk. They were individually owned hotels. Sometimes, as in our case, later on in the litigation, in order to put pressure, they sued not only the hotel corporation, but also the individual owners and officers that owned the hotel. They also sued the franchisee and the franchisors. The plaintiffs' lawyers were small plaintiffs' lawyers. They were not well funded. They certainly didn't have any third-party funders behind them. And then in the second wave, what we saw was larger hotel chains being hit, the major hotel chains that you know about, the Marriotts, the Hiltons, the Red Roofs. And they were suing the franchisee and the franchisor. Sometimes it was an independent relationship. Sometimes it was a corporate managed relationship. They were suing under the TVPRA, whereas in the first wave, they were negligence cases. They were premises cases. They were negligent hiring and retention cases. So they were going after the owners of the hotel for hiring someone at the front desk who couldn't spot this crime, which, oh, by the way, is hidden in clandestine. As you've heard multiple times, a theme you will hear throughout this presentation. So in the second wave, they were large plaintiffs' lawyers with lots and lots of funding, and they were cooperating around the country. They had local counsel, and then they had a more national law firm presence. And the defense lawyers in the second wave were big law, whereas they were smaller firms in that regard. We also saw a movement in the second wave of claiming that hotels that provided Wi-Fi were enabling the traffickers to do what they were doing. So in our cases, the original cases, they were trying to put the women up on Backpage, up on Craigslist, and 3 of the 4 were able to be put up there. The 4th one actually kept being shut down, and we believe it was because she looked like she was underage. She was not, but we believe that Backpage was taking it down because she looked like she was underage. So the allegation was that the hotel in the second wave of litigation knew or should have known that that's how the Wi-Fi was being used. Now, that ignores the fact that the hotel was situated in a shopping center scenario, and the hotel was next to a department store, and the traffickers actually brought the does into that store, bought them clothes, and then came over to the hotel. Also went to a breakfast location, never spotted. Went to a very large discount store with cameras. It was never spotted. And so it goes back to, in all of these waves, the traffickers are very smart. They parade the women around not scantily clad, but rather in street clothes. And the women are not asking for help. They're not sending notes. Contrary to what our complaint said, they did not ask for help, perhaps because of that mental tether, but it was not something that was easily identifiable by anyone at the front desk, especially someone who may only have a high school education. In the third wave, what we're seeing is a movement toward big tech. They're evolving in terms of their claims, how they use TVPRA. We're seeing, and Dr. Orozco will talk about this, rape and sexual assault being pled as TVPRA claims. It's very different. it's definitely evolving, if you will. And I'll tell you, I did get a strange email 2 days ago about an outfit that is recruiting trafficking victims, conceivably for help, but also conceivably to bring claims. And Dr. Orozco will talk about some of the third-party outfits out there that as countermeasure outfits, but really are not. So sometimes it's a hero, sometimes it's a villain, depending upon the nature of their practice, the nature of the training, the nature of the help that they're giving to the survivors. So that's sort of an overview of the different waves of litigation. As you can see here, there are a variety of defendants in the cases. In the second wave, we saw some big tech defendants, and some cases are proceeding. Some cases were bounced. And we also saw cases that were mostly filed in federal court, although in Texas there are some state cases that have some state claims as opposed to TVPRA claims. We did see a push toward MDL litigation, but that was thwarted in Florida. And I'll tell you that when the first wave of cases came, there were matters pending in 4 states: Pennsylvania, Maryland, Texas, and Georgia. Pennsylvania had a minor case. The other ones, I believe, were all adults. And now we see them in 13 plus states. Although I will say that I had 3 cases for a major hotel chain that got dismissed for no pay with prejudice. And my colleagues that are also in the litigation are having good results as well. It's kind of 50-50. Ohio is not a good jurisdiction. We'll talk about sort of the states that are good for the defense versus good for the plaintiffs, et cetera. What you see there is a state-of-the-art definition. And Jean had referenced FDCC. Dr. Orozco and I, an associate at Wilson-Elster, worked on a state-of-the-art article because it had not been done before. And we looked at sort of the evolution of trafficking from the Roman Empire to the present, what Dr. Orozco termed modern day slavery. And that article was published by FDCC in its Insights magazine. It was unbelievable to research and write because you really don't know all that is out there and all that has sort of evolved from, you know, the Roman Empire to the present until you've done that research. We talk about the white slave trade, and I know Dr. Orozco alluded a little bit to the racist element of human trafficking. Dr. Orozco, can you describe sort of in the 1900 time frame the state of the art that we saw with the Jack Jones, et cetera?
So, so when I teach and talk about trafficking, most of the time, if you like your average run-of-the-mill expert, they'll talk about trafficking beginning with in the year 2000, you know, with the TVPA, but actually the history of trafficking goes back over 100 years. So one of the first exposés on trafficking, back then it was called white, quote unquote, white slavery, began in 1885 with a publication called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. In that publication, a reporter by the name of W.T. Steed went undercover and, you know, tried to uncover the fact that a lot of the minors that were being sold in the commercial sex industry weren't of the age of consent, and, you know, they were being stolen or abused, and basically what was going on there. that expose led to not only changes in London, so that was in London, but in the United States on the age of consent. So first they started changing the law to increase the age of consent for sex, but eventually they passed what's known as the Mann Act, or the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. That law was intended to address sex trafficking, but in reality, the way that it was applied, the law was applied, it was extremely racialized. And I've written articles about that. So, for example, one of the first prosecutions under the White Slave Traffic Act, under the Mann Act, was against the heavyweight champion boxer who was African-American male named Jack Johnson. He was charged with trafficking because he had a white wife. And in the news articles from the early 1900s, he was also accused of immorally distributing materials that supported interracial relationships and marriages, like, quote unquote, my affair with a golden brown man. That was one of the publications that, was brought up during his trial. He was convicted of sex trafficking. And for years, for decades, those laws were used to predominantly, it was a very racialized application. It was used to support segregation. It was used to support Japanese internment camps during World War II. We don't have the best history of trafficking, our anti-trafficking legislation, and how it was used and who was criminalized under it. But it wasn't until, I believe it was a case, I think it was the Kosminski case in the late 1980s, where there were two mentally incapacitated individuals that were essentially coerced and deceived and used as slaves on I believe it was a farm, but the Supreme Court found that they were not guilty of, and overturned their conviction of, forced labor, of slavery. And that's what initiated or kind of sparked the need for the TVPA in 2000. But as far as how those laws continue to be applied, we still see some interesting ways that I don't necessarily are consistent with justice or the congressional intent of the application of those laws. So instead of going after actual traffickers, people who are holding individuals in modern slavery, we see, the laws being used to criminalize other acts. So for example, there are a number of plaintiff attorneys that think trafficking has come to the rescue for other gender-based harms. So they're pleading, for example, domestic violence cases as trafficking cases, or sexual harassment cases as trafficking cases, even though they're not. But we also see predominantly in civil courtrooms that these laws being used to go after third parties, innocent third parties that really unwittingly encounter these trafficking schemes, but they have deeper pockets, and that's why they are, going after as a target. So we have a very long and sordid history on the timeline of trafficking through the years. We're still trying to address it, but in reality, if you really do care about modern slavery, if you want to address this, we're really looking at people who are having their food, their housing, their, finances controlled, really a modern form of slavery. That's what we're addressing. That's what the crime is about, and that's what we're looking to combat. It's not about going after third parties because they have deep pockets, or pleading non-trafficking cases as trafficking because of the sensationalization of the topic.
All right, I want to move through the next few slides quickly. They basically show where there are cases and where defendants have gotten favorable rulings, where plaintiffs have gotten favorable rulings, etc. So there you have it. Defense wins in various cases over the last, I'd say, year and a half. Judge Marbley in Ohio. Ohio's been a particularly tough jurisdiction for defendants. And here you have the anti-trafficking legislation that you've heard Dr. Orozco and I refer to. So there was the TVPA, and then there was the Reauthorization Act several times, TVPRA 05, 08, and 13. And those are the statutes under which the current cases are being brought, the TVPRA claims, which authorized the filing of civil actions against third-party businesses, including hoteliers.
Marisa, just really quickly, I think that's a good segue into one of the questions we have in the chat. They asked who is suing. So the person who's trafficked, they're the named plaintiff, but Marisa had alluded to, there are these other third parties that are seeking out, like they're actively seeking out people to sue businesses. So for example, if you follow anti-trafficking nonprofits, I've seen these sponsored ads on Facebook saying, you know, did you go to a hotel? Did you sell sex there? If yes, you might have a lawsuit, like kind of those infomercials that you might see on late night TV of a lawyer looking for, you know, a plaintiff for a particular case. So we do have these third parties that are seeking out and kind of trying to find these cases against different businesses, but the named plaintiff in the case is the actual survivor or alleged survivor or victim.
Absolutely. So you have the does who are suing businesses, individuals, big tech. All right, John, I'm going to throw it to you. We've got 10 minutes and I want to make sure that you and Brittany get heard with this audience. So why don't you walk us through fintech and crypto?
Perfect. So starting with Thorn. Thorn is a nonprofit organization founded actually by Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore. And really it is an anti-human traffic organization with a real focus on preventing the sexual exploitation of children. And what their overall mission is that it's focused on the utilization of technology and software. And while technology is being used by the traffickers in order to further their illicit gains, right? Through the advertisements on both the normal web and on the dark web, right? It's now using this technology and understanding how the traffickers are using the technology and now using this technology against them to further uncover who they are and exactly what are they doing. So to that end, Thorn has been and continues to partner with major technology companies to develop and improve software in order to prevent the sexual exploitation of adults as well as children. And one such example of this is a piece of software called Spotlight. And Spotlight is Thorn's human trafficking investigating tool. And really what the overarching goal of the Spotlight software is to provide law enforcement with additional intelligence and leads that will give them more, that will not essentially bog them down in their investigation. And it will give them a lot more information in a much cleaner format, right? Because we all know law enforcement time is limited. So it will help them more quickly advance their investigative tools, okay? So it's a very complicated piece of software and I'm not gonna bog everyone down with the logistics of how it operates. But essentially from a very high level, online advertisements continue to be used, you know, both on the dark web and otherwise to promote the human trafficking, right? And law enforcement historically has been forced to manually review these thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of ads that are out there to try to link the pieces together to advance their investigation. And as I mentioned, right, law enforcement time is limited, monetary resources are limited, right? So they were just getting bogged down with the amount of information that was out there, you know, with the many ways these advertisements are spread throughout the dark web, and it was making their job just a lot more difficult. So what this Spotlight software is now focused on is that it uses a complex set of algorithms that can very more quickly review hundreds and thousands of ads at one time. And what it's looking for are common denominators across the dark web, right? Common email addresses, common Bitcoin addresses, common pictures of certain individuals. And essentially what it does is that it through these algorithms, it'll group together all these ads that are red flags and that seem to be intertwined and interconnected. And then it's able to present this package over to law enforcement and say, you know, this is what the software tool has been able to identify. These are the commonalities between what we are seeing. And then law enforcement is able, instead of being bogged down in everything that's out there, has this package in front of them that is very narrow, that is very focused. And they're able to use that on their investigation to start, you know, determining the identities of certain of these individuals. And clearly, up on the slide here, the success of Thorn and the success of Spotlight really speaks for themselves. And you know, within the first 6 months, the software identified 6,000 sex trafficking victims, and you know, overall over 17,000 you know, children with 9 children a day. And most importantly, right, this app is machine based, right? So as the traffickers, change up their MOs and learn more about these tools that are being used to identify them, and they start changing their methods. Well, the great thing about the Spotlight tool is that this algorithm can change along with them and can help keep pace with what the traffickers may be doing.
All right, turning to crypto.
So turning to crypto. So no surprise, but traffickers have been using cryptocurrency as a means to facilitate the trafficking, because there's always been a historical thought that it's the most anonymous form of currency. And to a certain extent, that's been true. But as cryptocurrency and Bitcoin has become more prevalent in mainstream society and is now being traded and bought and sold on a daily basis, right, it is starting to lose that level of anonymity. But it is still, at the end of the day, still very difficult, and you need to have the resources, you need to have the time, you need to have the experts who are able to track and understand Bitcoin, right? And there's a lot of moving pieces here. And really, when it comes down to cryptocurrency and using that as part of the anti-trafficking, it's really about knowledge, education, and collaboration. So what do I mean by that? First is the individuals who are really in the know, right? The anti-human trafficking intelligence initiatives, the nonprofit organizations like that, individuals like Dr. Orozco who have the fundamental knowledge, understand the red flags to what to be looking for when dealing with, cryptocurrency and other transactions. So, what are the red flags that we would be looking for, especially with crypto transactions, right? Frequent transactions in small amounts to common addresses, right? With these transactions, a lot of these being conducted off hours in the middle of the night, right? And then, certain payments being made to certain groups. If you're seeing a lot of small payments made to escort services in the middle of the night, right? Those are red flags from a cryptocurrency basis that we should be looking for, right? Another what we see common scheme is using Bitcoin to pay for what I'll call prepaid credit cards, right? So you're using the Bitcoin, buying the prepaid credit card, and the traffickers believe that's adding another level of anonymity, right? But ultimately, we're able to still track, hopefully, the purchase of those prepaid cards, right? So what we're starting to see nowadays is, groups working together and collaborating, right? So we are seeing the nonprofit organizations, the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, now working with the major Bitcoin exchanges, who are then bringing on the blockchain analysis firms, and then ultimately looping in law enforcement as well, right? So it starts with the knowledge of the anti-human trafficking organizations, right? Pointing out to the cryptocurrency exchanges, here are the red flags you should be looking for as a crypto exchange. And if you're starting to see this throughout your environment, let's be red flagging that. And then once the crypto exchange is able to flag these transactions, bringing it to what I'll call the blockchain analysis firms, right? Who are now able to use the blockchain to track, the Bitcoin exchange and the flow of the cryptocurrency. And then finally, taking all of these results, taking all of this analysis and providing it to law enforcement to further aid in their investigation.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. All right, what are we talking about? Supply and demand. We've talked about how to spot a doe and how difficult that is, and how it's a clandestine and hidden crime. How do you affect supply? So supply is, the demand refers to the Johns. And in our cases, it was very difficult to spot a John. It's not like they were lined outside the door of the hotel, despite what the complaint said. And in one case, the case that actually blew up our matter and really allowed us to reach a favorable settlement was that there was an off-duty police officer who was looking for one of the rooms. He was drunk, wielding a gun. Our front desk called the police, and the question came back, well, did you knock on the door? And the police said no. We had no reason to. We had no reason to suspect where the drunken police officer was going. He was arrested. And then the question became, well, did the front desk go and knock on the door? Well, if the police, who are trained to spot something like this, did not see it, how would the front desk know to do that? They're lay, they're high school educated. They're not trained to spot something that is hidden, and they're certainly not authorized to go into a hotel room where there's a right of privacy. There's a reason we have vacator statutes, because even jurists get it wrong. even jurists can't see it. So when we talk about supply and demand, we're talking about affecting who's asking for these services. And there was a study in London where men were interviewed and said that they would be deterred from using women in prostitution if their names, or there was the threat of their names being added to a sex offender registry, imprisonment, or public exposure, such as a billboard announcement, newspaper notice, internet webpage, or through a letter to their family or employer. The interviewees cited higher fines, greater criminal penalties, and suspension of driver's license or car impoundment as deterrents if laws and penalties would actually be enforced. So that's sort of what we mean by that. 45 states so far require convicted sex traffickers to register as sex offenders. We talked a little bit about affecting the supply through these organizations. Dr. Orozco or Brittany, do you have anything to add on the supply and demand side?
Just to elaborate a little bit, you mentioned vacator statutes, but just to explain to the audience what those are. So basically, it's so difficult to identify a victim that victims are routinely and often criminalized. They're charged with things related to their own victimization, or they're charged with things that their trafficker made them do. And because of that, because we recognize that happens so often, over 50% of states have what's called a vacator statute, which expunges that conviction. So that essentially means the police officer got it wrong, the jury got it wrong, the judge got it wrong, the prosecutor got it wrong. All those individuals got it wrong as far as identifying this person as a victim. And I think that is a very good example to say, how do you expect a private business to get it right when all of these trained individuals are getting it wrong? And then also just to, I don't know, Marisa, if you wanted to take a look, we have a few other questions that came in.
Before we do that, let's let Brittany cover coverage and liability really quickly, because I'm sure there are people in the audience who want to hear about the policy language. So Brittany, take it away. We have 2 minutes, I think.
Okay, I'll be super brief. So coverage and liability in these cases, those are two concepts that are distinctly different and go hand in hand in the investigation of these cases and what a policy will cover. So for this audience, I'll just use our example of the commercial insurance policy for a hotel. So there's several different perspectives, and there's several different strategic positions that can be taken when handling these. First of all, if there's any other parties that should be brought into the suit, like in our case, we had the franchisee and franchisor scenario where we needed to get them involved, or the parent company of the hotel. That can all play into the liability, bringing more insurance companies to the table. In terms of just the policy language, like you see on this slide, there is a big push in the insurance world to have their underwriting staff and their policy language constantly evolving, just like these crimes are, and incorporating different limitations or different exclusions on the policy. Because you have to think and realize that the intent of policies is not to insure criminal acts. Aside from just this one exclusion you can see on the screen, insurance does not want to provide coverage to criminals or to any resulting acts that they have. So in our cases, we didn't have those sort of limitations. Some policies may say, you know what, if we get a claim that has to do with an assault or a sexual molestation, we're only going to provide X amount of coverage. And I like that because that puts a cap on what's available. It deters the plaintiffs. It kind of helps set a standard that this is not okay. These are not acceptable cases to pursue. It impacts settlement values. It impacts, the precedent and the case law that's out there. I could talk all day about this. I know we've got only a couple minutes.
Okay, and there you have the pending deck actions. There are others, but the Star indemnity is the one that I'm most familiar with in favor of coverage. But we want to get through the rest of this, and I know there are questions. Dr. Orozco, I can't see those questions, so if you want to shout them out. And
yeah,
if we have
One question was, how can ADR be used in addressing cases of human trafficking, seeing that trafficking is generally a crime and yet have features that affects individuals much more? And this is from an ADR practitioner.
Well, I can tell you, Judge Miller did a fantastic job with us. It was 4 cases that he was tackling, and we would not have resolved the cases but for the initial shot across the bow in attempting to mediate the cases. Obviously, Brittany then stepped in and wound up negotiating directly with the plaintiff's lawyers to get it resolved. But I do think it was helpful to sit across the table, have my claims rep looking at the plaintiff and sizing up the plaintiff's lawyer for trial purposes, and kind of being able to take back to the carrier what she saw and what she expected. What do you say, Brittany? How important was that mediation?
Oh, it was extremely important. Had we not ultimately resolved the case, it was crucial for me to be able to see these plaintiffs and put myself in the juror's spot and see what they were going to see and exactly what we were going to be up against. And having Judge Miller as a neutral party there, I mean, he, like you said, Marisa, he did a fantastic job.
Yeah. Dr. Orozco, any others?
No, I was just going to say, I just shared a link with everybody on some of the impetus behind, these plaintiff cases. But as far as the utility of ADR, I think it's good. And I think some of the resources are, look into what trafficking is, understand what that is, but understand, and the reason why I share that link, understand the impetus behind these cases being filed, because it's just because it presents as an altruistic, helping a survivor, it doesn't always mean that's the actual case. Look to say, ask the question, is this actually trafficking? Is it modern slavery? And second, is this third party really to blame? I know that, Brittany talked about insurance coverage. One of the things they talk about in that article, Trafficking to the Rescue, is how they file these cases against innocent third parties because, they're trying to circumvent intentional tort barriers, to say, okay, well, they didn't commit the act. They allege that they knew or should have known. So just be aware, it's a clandestine crime. It's difficult to identify. Just make sure you understand what trafficking is and make sure it fits within those parameters of modern slavery. But also, is this person, could they have known? And more often than not, the answer is no. It's very clandestine. We're having, survivors not asking for help. They don't disclose. So just make sure you're aware of that in any kind of ADR setting.
So true. So true. Audience, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, you have our contact information up. We really enjoyed being here. As you know, and can tell, we are passionate about this topic and there's a lot to cover. So appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Marisa. Thank you, Dr. Orozco. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Fascinating program. And please do feel free to contact them for your specific questions. Have a great day, everyone. Take care. Bye.